Hello and welcome back to the CCSE Research Conference, Democracy and Media. Up next is our panel, Television, Technology, and Historical Narratives. In this session, three historians use the C-SPAN video library to study the recent impact of television on modern democratic conventions, the primary campaigns of Reverend Jesse Jackson, and in fundamentally changing the nature of newsrooms. These papers serve to demonstrate how history, television, and archives interconnect and can be used to develop new perspectives in research. This panel is moderated by Brian Rosenwald, scholar in residence at the Partnership for Effective Public Administration and Leadership Ethics at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Rosenwald is an instructor at UPenn and author of Talk Radio's America: How an Industry Took Over a Political Party That Took Over the United States. He is an editor of Made by History at the Washington Post, a political analyst for NBC 10 Philadelphia, and a regular contributor to The Week. His commentary and analysis have appeared everywhere from CNN to NPR to the Washington Post and The Atlantic. Welcome, Brian Rosenwald.
Thank you, Andrea. It's my pleasure to be with you. I'm very excited for this panel, and I'm going to introduce the presenters. Then they're going to give you some background, read their papers, and then I'm hoping to foster a conversation at what I see as the intersection of their three papers. So you won't hear too much from me, but I'll just try to keep the trains running and give us all time to weigh in here. So without further ado, our three esteemed panelists. Kathryn Cramer Brownell is an associate professor of history at Purdue University. She's an editor of Made by History at the Washington Post. Her research and teaching focus on the intersection between media, politics, and popular culture, with a particular emphasis on the American presidency. Her first book, Showbiz Politics, Hollywood and American Political Life, from the University of North Carolina Press, came out in 2014, and it examines the institutionalization of entertainment styles and structures in American politics and the rise of the celebrity presidency. She is now completing a new book project on the political history of cable television that I know is going to be really path-breaking and exciting for all of us. Heather Hendershot is a professor of film and media at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She is a former editor of Cinema Journal, the official publication of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies, and she has had fellowships at NYU, Princeton, Stanford, and Harvard. Hendershot has also been a Guggenheim Fellow. Her two most recent books are What's Fair in the Air, Cold War Right-Wing Broadcasting in the Public Interest, and Open to Debate, How William F. Buckley Put Liberal America on the Firing Line. Hendershot's book on network TV coverage of the 1968 Chicago Democratic National Convention is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press. And finally, last but not least, Allison Perlman is an associate professor of history and film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. She is the author of Public Interest, Media Advocacy, and the Struggles Over U.S. Television from Rutgers University Press. And she's currently working on two projects related to the history of U.S. public media. So what I thought I'd do here is let Heather lead off and kind of take this in chronological order. Heather and then Allison and then Katie, although Katie's paper starts a little bit before Allison's, but goes a lot longer chronologically in scope. So that way we'll keep you going in a chronological way, and then I'll try to kind of pull these threads together. So without further ado, Heather, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Brian. Let me just apologize if there's too much background noise here. Someone just started riding a power mower outside my window. I'm on the third floor, but it seems to be coming up here. So sorry about that buzz in the background. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Go and go to slideshow. There we go. So the title of my paper, Television Chaos and Reform, Revisiting the 1968 and 1972 Democratic National Conventions via the C-SPAN archive. The expanded version of this paper will use the C-SPAN video library to analyze the contested nature and cultural historical memory of political conventions on American television, focusing specifically on the 1972 Democratic National Convention and taking the 1968 convention as a counterpoint. It will draw both on C-SPAN's archival footage as well as scholarship that has emerged since the conventions took place. And in my shorter presentation today, I'm going to give you a condensed version and share some crucial clips and images. At the 1968 convention, Mayor Richard Daley deviously attempted to prevent the networks from providing live coverage outside the convention hall in the streets, where the gathering of 10,000 anti-Vietnam protesters undeniably constituted a major newsworthy story. Of course, American TV viewers still saw the street action, just not live. In particular, late on the third night of the convention, they watched videotape footage of Chicago police beating and arresting protesters in front of the Conrad Hilton. And I'm just going to show you this image that is a iconic news image of the time, showing the battle, but also it's sort of lived on historically as an image that sort of symbolizes the 60s and the turmoil of America at that time. It is these images that have dominated the media historians' accounts of the 68 convention, along with a few crises from inside the amphitheater, such as Mayor Daley expressing his rage as he was here making repeatedly a throat-cutting gesture to end the convention late one night. Another crisis within the amphitheater was when CBS's Walter Cronkite referred to security men who had slugged Dan Rather. Quite famously, he called them a bunch of thugs. And here's another iconic moment of Rather right before he's punched in the stomach by security men. The dominant historical memory of Chicago then is of street violence, and inside the convention hall of a handful of reactions to Daley sanctioned violence. These are the images that have circulated in the past 50 years, recounted in scholarship and recycled in documentary film and television productions. There are no similarly resonant, or if you will, mythologized images or moments from the 1972 DNC. In fact, this image that I opened with should be an iconic moment from that convention. Eagleton and George McGovern have just been selected as the vice presidential and presidential nominee, respectively. And this is the kind of great publicity image you would think would circulate quite a bit. But of course, Eagleton was forced to step down a week or two after the convention because it was revealed he had a history of mental health issues. And so this image that should have been iconic was quickly dismissed by the campaign, and they started to figure out if they should distance themselves from the convention altogether. The 72 convention has appeared to be a less impactful media event than 68. Indeed, media historians have shown no interest in the 72 convention and only slightly more in the 68 event, a situation I strive to rectify in my forthcoming book. In 68, angry delegates had decried the fact that they were enduring a closed convention where the candidate had been predetermined by the party's leaders. In 72, various reforms in the delegate selection process struck hard at the old machine players. Mayor Daley and his delegation were even ejected and replaced by Jesse Jackson's Illinois delegates. Yet the attendees were no less angry than those of 4 years earlier, and unlike earlier delegates, many of them were outsiders to the system and did not understand the procedural basics. So here's an example of one of these new kinds of delegates on the floor, where we saw feminists and gay liberationists and welfare rights activists like this woman here, and she's got a natural afro and she's wearing a leather vest, and it's the kind of image that would play very well in households that were progressive or liberal, but that was terrifying to a large number of conservative or right-wing Americans. The result was chaos on the floor of the convention that rivaled that of 68, though without the violence. The TV cameras once again caught it all. At times, the images clearly conveyed a party out of control. For example, on the final night, the inexperienced delegates spent hours making token vice presidential nominations. The result was that McGovern's acceptance speech was aired at 3 a.m., a point that he and his advisors would emphasize in later years in interviews conducted by C-SPAN, for example, as pivotal to his loss. Network coverage revealed a convention that couldn't even let its own preferred candidate give a major primetime speech, thereby sacrificing a half-hour free publicity. If the crisis of 1968 was that the whole world was watching, the crisis of 1972 was that it was not, at least not watching the most important speech of the whole convention. The C-SPAN video library offers several kinds of material that help us understand the importance of the 72 convention as a mediated event. First, there are a number of interviews with McGovern, strategists, and McGovern himself, and these are of mixed value, I would say. For teaching, they're excellent. For example, a 10-minute interview with McGovern from 1988 was aired before his 1972 speech was shown on C-SPAN. The interview reiterates talking points the senators made repeatedly over the years about how he chose his vice presidential candidate, his relationship with others contending for the nomination, and so on. For example, one of the other candidates was Shirley Chisholm, another example, obviously, of a new diversity at the convention. The advantage of showing the McGovern interview to students is that, of course, the average 20-year-old knows nothing of the 72 convention or Shirley Chisholm or George McGovern or much else. And this conveys a condensed version of the story and enables them to put a face to the name. C-SPAN's video of McGovern's acceptance speech is of greater value to the professor and the historian than the interview is, though I would add that the very last comment from McGovern in the 1988 interview is absolutely heart-wrenching. And I'm just going to leave my PowerPoint for just a second and pull up that clip for you of, I'm going to show you the last minute from that 1998 McGovern interview aired on C-SPAN right before they aired the acceptance speech. Here we go.
On the acceptance page.
Did you ever get any indications as to how many Americans actually saw your speech delivered at 3 in the morning?
I was told that about 2.5 or 3 million people saw it.
What do you think you would have had it been on a prime time?
Probably 80 million, something like that. That was a popular convention. There was a lot of interest in it. People were watching it all across the country. And I'm convinced if they had seen me at 9:30 or 10 o'clock deliver that speech, which was the best speech I ever gave in my life, I think it would have changed the outcome of the election. We might not have won, but it would have set off favorable comment from coast to coast in this country that might have enabled us to survive the Eagleton crisis a week later.
Well, George McGovern, 16 years later, we're going to put it on a different time. And thank you for offering your perspective on the convention and giving us this introduction as we show our audience your acceptance speech from 1972.
I'm going to be glad to see it in prime time.
So he says that in a sort of friendly way, but I just feel it's really poignant when he says, oh yeah, now it's fine. For the first time ever, it's going to be shown in prime time. I'm just going to go back to my slideshow and just get us back to that image of Shirley Chisholm. Another type of C-SPAN library material relevant to the study of political conventions and campaigns is the panel discussions. These, to my mind, are often more informative and useful for both research and teaching than the one-on-one interviews. The open discussion can result in people going off script and making more revealing comments than those in the stories they've told and retold over time, perhaps inspired by the presence, in some cases, of an audience. A really interesting 1997 panel discussion on the 72 campaign includes Frank Mankiewicz, Morris Dees, and Hunter S. Thompson, and includes an audience Q&A session. And just adding this image from, when Hunter S. Thompson was writing his book, his articles were appearing in Rolling Stone along the way, and this image was by Ralph Steadman on the cover of Rolling Stone, a sort of hideous caricature of McGovern, showing that perhaps there is such a thing as bad publicity. Anyway, this panel discussion includes an audience Q&A session where panelists get into valuable, wonky policy issues about polling and direct mail campaigns, which is just great stuff. And a question about news bias against Nixon is shot down. This is a question from the audience. It's shot down with vigor by the panelists, still furious about the media's ignoring of the lies propagated in Nixon campaign ads. As both a teacher and a researcher, I find the most useful C-SPAN material on the 72 convention and election to be the rebroadcast of material from the Times, specifically advertisements, campaign films, and nominating and acceptance speeches. The Real America series on American History TV is what I'm thinking of here, and it's just invaluable. It's fantastic for research and teaching. Of course, all of us who teach about media and American political campaigns are aware of the Museum of the Moving Images Living Room Candidate website, which contains many campaign ads, but C-SPAN holds additional materials such as the half-hour campaign films that used to circulate on TV between the conventions in the summer and the election in the fall. These are widely forgotten artifacts of the network era of mass audiences before the targeted micromanaged advertising that is dominated in the era of niche media and, more specifically, social media. The McGovern campaign hired Charles Guggenheim to make their ads and documentaries. Guggenheim had made the JFK memorial film for the '64 Democratic Convention and also the '68 memorial film for Bobby Kennedy. Even Hunter S. Thompson, alienated by most aspects of political campaigning and particularly TV ads, was impressed by Guggenheim's work for McGovern in '72, saying that the candidate's, quote, 30-minute biography was so good that even the most cynical veteran journalist said it was the best political film ever made for television, and Guggenheim's 60-second spots were better than the biofilm. The 60-second spots, which I encourage you to check on the Living Room Candidates site, and some of them are 4 minutes. They're really amazing stuff. They're really excellent, especially the rap session with Vietnam vets in a VA hospital. I believe the title of that one is Young Vets. Guggenheim found a positive angle on the openness of the '72 convention. Most of his spots ran a minute, but he also shot a 4-minute ad focused entirely on the little d democratic nature of the convention as a strong point. One interviewee observed, "A lot of people said, oh, you lost prime time by being up all night. Well, that to me was great, and every delegate that was there and stayed with it." The point here, also made by other delegates in the ad, was that these newcomers were not in Miami to party. They were there to work. Another interviewee singles out the fact that delegates were making peanut butter and jelly sandwiches on the convention floor because they couldn't afford to eat in hotels. And anyway, it wasn't a convention to play. So we see this sort of liberal populism throughout these ads that we also see in the half-hour film. Like the other Guggenheim ads, this one was shot mostly with handheld camera to convey immediacy and authenticity. Several shots even include lens flare, the halo effect from sunshine that before Easy Rider and other countercultural films was understood by cinematographers as ruining a shot. Kathleen Hall Jamieson argues in Packaging the Presidency that the cinema verite style that dominated McGovern's campaign ultimately worked against him, as his statements were often extemporaneous, whereas Nixon was consistently tight, scripted, and professional. That verite was even used in McGovern's convention-centered ads points strongly to the campaign's strong desire to spin their convention as a huge success because it spoke not just to the young, but also to the sensibilities of the young, sensibilities which could theoretically be shared by voters of all ages. And that didn't play out, obviously, in November. Still, McGovern leaned into his convention imagery about as hard as Hubert Humphrey had avoided his own 4 years earlier. In the biographical film, Guggenheim mixes this verite style with a somewhat more conventional documentary style, featuring swelling dramatic music and a narrative voiceover. This clip from the end of the film, which I'm going to show you and then bring things quickly to a close, includes numerous excerpts from the ads reused in the biographical film. So the first part of it shows clips from the ads, and the second part goes back to the new material for the biographical film. And you'll see cameras in the shot, are visible in the shot, which is a very kind of modern verite look, a lot of handheld material, and a lot of natural location lighting as well. So we're just going to take a look at that. Let's see, here we go, and one moment, voila.
They were, in their own way, equally unfair.
Well, I just lost my husband, and we had a terrific income, but it all went taking care of him now, and I'm really down to nothing.
And I can't go to school for the rest of my life, and my folks aren't going to support me for the rest of my life. I mean, there ain't no jobs open.
The greater imperative is to get the drugs out of the neighborhoods.
This gets down to our crime rate, and the guy who's given up trying to make a buck and goes out and holds somebody up, he gets put in jail. We support him.
He died. They found him in his room. This is American veteran.
I got to pay 20% of what I earn in taxes, whereas some of the major industries in the country only got to pay under 10%.
Your lunch has been added on this, 5 cents on that. Before you know you pay, well, you may as well pay the money for the meat.
They make more profits working me 11 hours or 12 hours a day than they do working 3 shifts, 8 hours a day, because they don't have to pay any kind of human benefit.
The farmer is not getting out of his product what he should have. I think it's a crime.
Farmers getting squeezed off.
I'm not one of these feminists that go around shouting all stuff. I just want what's fair for us.
There should be something done so each individual would benefit from the life he spends on this earth. Just to work in a plant all those years to get your pension benefits, and then that's the end of your life. It just seems so ridiculous and unrewarding is really the word for it, unrewarding.
I love the United States. but I love it enough so I want to see some changes made. The American people want to believe in their government, want to believe in their country, and I'd like to be one of those that provides the kind of leadership that would help restore that kind of faith. I don't say I can do it alone, of course I can't, but the president can help set a new tone in this country. He can help raise the vision and the faith and the hope of the American people, and that's what I'd like to try to do.
I'd like to get a president that we can believe in.
I now seek the presidency as a public servant whose career has been...
His announcement, a year before everyone else, was not, in the words of one reporter, a prospect that brought fear to the hearts of the opposition. But perhaps what George McGovern was saying that day was heard more clearly in other rooms, in other places. They were, in the most part, unpaid volunteers, determined in 1972 to make the process work. In a time...
Okay, so then I'm going to stop sharing now. We learn more about the populist nature of the campaign and the small donor approach and so on. As I continue this research, I hope to expand our understanding of the importance of the 1972 convention as both a political event and a televisual event on its own, but also in relationship to 68. While most see 72 as a reaction against the chaos of 68, I understand it more as a continuation of the crises of that convention, also suffused with chaos, though of a different valence. And I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Heather. That was very interesting. And now we're going to jump 16 years into the future. And Allison's going to tell us about the 1984 Democratic primary.
Okay, first I just want to say thank you so much to Robert Browning and Andrea Langrish for putting on such an exceptional conference. I also want to apologize in advance for any potential ambient noise. They're doing construction outside my building, and hopefully the jackhammers will abate during this presentation, but apologies in advance for that. And I'm going to get started with my presentation on the Jesse Jackson phenomenon revisited, C-SPAN, television, and the Democratic primaries of 1984 and 1988. With the exception of C-SPAN, wrote New York Amsterdam news columnist Abiola Sinclair in 1987, the white media generally has been ignoring Jesse Jackson or playing him down. Though Sinclair noted at the time that Jackson was the frontrunner to secure the Democratic nomination, the press refused to acknowledge his popularity and instead drummed up criticism of Jackson that had been ubiquitous when he had run for president in 1984. This coverage of Jackson for Sinclair was part and parcel of the mainstream press's relationship to the Black community and its tendency to alternate between negative coverage and no coverage whatsoever. Sinclair's qualification, with the exception of C-SPAN, notably acknowledged how the cable network strayed from the practices of commercial media in its coverage of the presidential primaries broadly and of Jackson's candidacy specifically. If the goal of C-SPAN, since this first went on the air in 1979, was to provide viewers with unmediated access to the workings of government, delivered initially through its coverage of congressional sessions and hearings, its campaign coverage furthered this mission by its capacious programming of campaign events. C-SPAN's refusal of explicit editorial comment or media frames was of especial utility to a candidate like Jackson, whose position as a, quote, serious Black contender for a major party's nomination, and whose policies views pushes the boundaries of legitimate debate in the 1980s, had proven a challenge to the political press corps. C-SPAN's coverage of Jackson's speeches and debate performances allowed the candidate to speak for himself. It would be up to viewers to assess the efficacy of his policy prescriptions, the wisdom of his diagnoses of contemporary problems, or the viability of his campaign to secure the Democratic nomination. Thus, one way to understand C-SPAN's coverage of the primaries in the 1980s and of Jackson's campaigns in particular is that it's an antidote to the commercial media, one that provided comprehensive coverage of campaign events and debates rather than selective reporting provided by the broadcast networks. As I further discuss, C-SPAN's programming operated not only as a corrective, but as an interlocutor and critic. C-SPAN's call-in shows and forums provided sites to articulate criticisms of the commercial media and to discuss and disrupt ideas calcifying within their coverage. These programs furthered, though, with the exception of C-SPAN position of the network, as its own programming and editorial decisions seldom were enfolded into the critiques of the media, explicit or implicit, made within these shows. That is, if the very format of C-SPAN registered disapproval of how the media covered politics, its programming also gave voice to overt criticism of the press corps' coverage of the Jackson campaign. The necessity of a network like C-SPAN had only accelerated in the 1970s and 1980s when the role of the media in presidential primary campaigns expanded. In the wake of the 1968 election, the Democratic National Committee assembled a commission to reconfigure how the Democratic nominee for president was to be selected. The Commission on Party Structure and Delegate Selection, commonly known as the McGovern-Fraser Commission, intentionally diminished the long-standing role of party elites in delegate selection and privileged state primaries and caucuses. Over the course of the next decade and a half, the Democratic Party would continue to alter its delegate selection rules in the face of electoral defeats for the White House, and would increasingly re-elevate the role of party elites in the form of superdelegates in the nominee selection process. Yet the result of these changes would be an elevation of the role of the media and a demotion of the role of parties and party leaders in the selection of nominees for president. In the wake of the McGovern-Fraser reforms, in other words, the press increasingly functioned as an active player in shaping the political fortunes of those running for the nomination. It was against this backdrop that Jackson launched his campaign. In addition, the 1984 and especially the 1988 elections took place alongside sizable changes in the US media environment. And the impact of many of these shifts, outside purchases of the major broadcast networks, increased subscriptions to cable services, the rise of independent broadcast stations, the launch of the Fox Broadcasting Network, and the repeal or diminishment of public interest regulations, was a transformation in commercial network news practices. Seeking desirable audiences to sell to advertisers, news coverage of elections focused on the cultivation of drama and conflict, emphasized spectacle and entertainment, and amplified horse race coverage of elections. In this context, C-SPAN earned a reputation in its campaign coverage for fairness and neutrality, as well as for thoroughness. C-SPAN's approach to political programming, though reaching a far smaller audience than the broadcast networks, adamantly defied the dazzle of network programming in favor of extensive coverage of rallies, debates, forums, news conferences, and political conventions. The low-budget aesthetic of its programming only underlined its contrast to the broadcast networks and highlighted its commitment to public service over entertainment and ratings. C-SPAN's coverage of Jackson's 1984 and 1988 runs specifically took 7 forms overall: campaign events, forums in which Jackson appeared with other candidates running for the nomination, debates between the candidates in the lead up to the primaries and caucuses, Jackson press conferences, convention coverage, call-in shows primarily with campaign surrogates, and forum discussions and book talks about the campaign. In addition, in 1988, C-SPAN inaugurated its weekly Road to the White House program, a series that tempered the network's commitment to unobstructed coverage with more explicitly mediated and edited perspectives on campaign events. By and large, most of C-SPAN's coverage was of Jackson himself. To view it is to see how both campaigns, Jackson simultaneously staked positions to the left of the mainstream Democratic Party in the 1980s, legitimated his candidacy through appeals to moral leadership, and positioned his campaign as a necessary fusion of social movement activism with electoral politics. At the core of Jackson's political project was the Rainbow Coalition, an appeal to voters across racial and ethnic lines to find common cause in a fight for economic justice. Explicitly repudiating Reaganism, Jackson insisted that the lives of people of color, workers, farmers, and women had been imperiled by the deregulation of environmental and labor protections, the offshoring of US jobs, and an increasingly bellicose and expansive foreign policy that sanctioned and enabled violent human rights abuses and led the world closer to nuclear war. In addition, Jackson advocated for the Equal Rights Amendment and paid family leave, and for an extension of civil rights laws to sexual minorities. Jackson also ran an anti-corporate campaign highlighting the responsibilities of US companies for offshoring US jobs, elevating profits over the well-being of their workforce. Jackson's speeches frequently made this point, as when at the Jefferson-Jackson dinner in Wisconsin in 1988, he analogized the economic violence of plant closures in Kenosha to the political violence facing civil rights activists in Selma. This claim was a consistent part of Jackson's campaign, as his was refrained that, quote, South Koreans did not take jobs from us, GM took jobs to them with government incentives. Jackson furthermore redirected attention to US foreign policy to advocate for denuclearization and diplomacy, redirect money spent on weapons to domestic programs, and highlight the unspoken racism of US policy priorities. Jackson, especially in the 1988 election, focused on the issue of drugs, insisting that the flow of drugs was both a foreign policy issue in terms of supply and an economic disinvestment issue in terms of demand. Jackson campaign appearances furthermore anticipated and addressed concerns over his lack of qualifications for the office that he sought. he routinely stressed his longstanding political activism for a range of causes, inclusive of but not limited to African-American civil rights. In this, Jackson drew stark comparisons between himself and his opponents, contrasting their governing and policy experience with his record of moral leadership. And I'd like to show you just a very quick clip of Jackson making this kind of claim, which was pretty routine in his campaign speeches.
Just believe we should have public accommodations. I marched about it. They were old enough, but they were not there. I didn't just believe we should have the right to vote. I marched and risked my life about it. They were old enough. They were not there. I didn't believe in Chicago we should have open housing. I marched about it. They were old enough. They were not there. I didn't just believe we should bring Goodman home from Syria. I went to get him and brought it.
This sentiment was repeated in additional speeches, for example, in March of 1988. Jackson told of his support of Teamsters in Cincinnati, of gay and lesbian protesters in DC affirming their civil rights, and a peace activist opposing South African apartheid, support that, according to him, his competitors refused to provide for fear of their impact on their political fortunes. This insistence was not only an implicit rebuke of the press's credibility discourse that had marred his campaign, but of the very criteria deployed within it. Jackson also stressed in his speeches how his platform and his candidacy was itself an opportunity for moral renewal. If his platform insisted that the fate of farmers, workers, the uninsured, racial minorities, religious minorities, and sexual minorities were intertwined, his campaign also offered his own electoral success as a moral test for the nation and its commitment to racial egalitarianism and equal opportunity. He did this by, for example, in a 1984 address at Cheyney University, placing voting for him in a lineage that included Rosa Parks' decision to divide segregated seating on buses, Greensboro students staging sit-ins to desegregate lunch counters, and civil rights activists risking their lives in Mississippi and Alabama to extend voting rights to all. In addition to this coverage of Jackson's campaign events and participation in debates, the network C-SPAN aired call-in programs, book talks, and panel discussions that addressed the Jackson campaign. C-SPAN dedicated call-in shows both in 1984 and 1988 to the Jackson campaign with campaign surrogates, advisors, and with Jackson himself. While conversations across the programs varied, there were topics and tropes that recurred across many of them. Guests were often asked about Jackson's relationship to the Jewish community and questioned his relationship to Nation of Islam leader Louis Farrakhan, as well as routine questions about whether Jackson himself was a communist. Especially in 1988, the shows increasingly focused on the Democratic Party's relationship to its Black constituency, the treatment of Jackson by the party positioned as a synecdoche for its responsiveness to the concerns of the Black community. Other shows highlighted the diversity of political opinion within the Black community as callers expressed divergent views on Jackson's platform. Importantly, another recurring topic was the role of the media. In a February 1984 show with political consultant John Tapscott and Iowa campaign co-director Jesse Taylor, for example, in response to a caller question, they addressed how the media had unfairly questioned Jackson's legitimacy as a candidate, harped on controversies that were not controversial, and reduced him to the, quote, Black candidate, ignoring the coalitional politics at the center of his campaign. Ann Lewis, advisor to the Jackson campaign in 1988, further addressed the role of the media and especially the mainstream press in attention to Jackson's campaign for the early part of the 1988 primaries. C-SPAN's telecasts of forums and panels further interrogated the performance of the press in covering Jackson. The C-SPAN archive includes a telecast of a press conference to discuss C. Anthony Burroughs' analysis of the 1984 election, Horse of a Different Color, in which he expressly stated that commercial television's coverage of Jackson positioned him as unelectable and was motivated by an uninterrogated racism. And I just want to show a short clip of that press conference.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Eddie Williams, president of the Joint Center for Political Studies. On behalf of my colleagues, I want to
I apologize. That clip is not linked up the way I thought it was. But I can find it and return to it in the Q&A if possible. Essentially, Bro did a study of network news coverage of the Jackson campaign, argued that in the horse race mode, or the mode in which journalists assess the viability, credibility, electability of candidates, Jackson was far less frequently placed in that mode, and Bro accounts for this divergence in Jackson's race, that essentially journalists could not imagine that the Black candidate could be viable and electable in 1984. This focus on the media recurs throughout the coverage of these elections. A November 1988 panel at Drake University, also carried by C-SPAN, was dedicated to media coverage of the Jackson campaign, in which print journalists acknowledged how Jackson's race factored into their coverage of the campaign. Panels of journalists and political consultants in 1987, in anticipation of the 1988 campaign, further spoke to how the press treated Jackson differently than other candidates, underlining that his race accounted for differing standards of journalists applied to his campaign. Thus, by circumstance and by design, C-SPAN's coverage of the Jackson campaigns not only allowed for Jackson, through telecasts of his unedited speeches, rallies, and debate performances, to counter mainstream media tropes about his campaign, but also explicitly offered a platform to surrogates, voters, academics, and journalists themselves to reflect on the challenges his campaign posed to the press corps, and to flag how Jackson's race was delimited by how the media could see his candidacy, his constituency, and his viability. C-SPAN functioned during these campaigns not only as a corrective to the commercial press, but as a site that magnified criticisms of the media's performance. So to conclude, there are a number of ways to reflect on the significance of Jackson's run for the Democratic nomination in 1984 and 1988. We can position these campaigns, as Jackson himself has, as anticipating and enabling the election of Barack Obama in 2008. We can also look to Jackson's runs as precursors to the campaigns of Bernie Sanders and their shared efforts to move both the moral and political calculus of the Democratic Party and recenter progressive politics in its platforms. We also can see in the complicated relationship of Democratic nominees to Jackson, captured in a number of programs in the C-SPAN archive, a rehearsal of a longstanding and resilient ambivalence over the party's relationship to a rainbow coalition and its imagined impact on the anticipated electoral preferences of white voters. And the materials in the C-SPAN archive provide ample material to build out all of these narratives and draw substantive comparisons. But as my analysis today identifies, another important facet of the archive on the Jackson campaign is not only in how it offered programming distinct from other media outlets, but in how it acknowledged explicitly the failures of the press to contend with a Black candidate. This is a longstanding critique of the media, perhaps best articulated in the 1968 Cramer report, that the press could operate as an institution that propelled racial inequality. And it is this facet of the Jackson campaign that strikes me as particularly important to remember, as in the intervening years, other criticisms of the media have had perhaps greater purchase in our public life. The Jackson campaign and the castigations of the media's coverage of him, with the exception of and amplified within C-SPAN, thus requires a grappling with the failures of the political press corps and the racialized logics that guide their assessment of leadership.
Thank you, Allison. And Katie is now going to bring in kind of the other pillar of cable news pre-mid-90s, which is CNN, and show another angle of the value of the C-SPAN archive.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Allison and Heather, for being on this panel and for showing me some of the incredible stuff in the C-SPAN archives that I have not seen. It's really exciting to see the rich archive that is in this video library. Thank you also to Robert and Andrea for organizing this conference and the incredible work you've done to make it a reality for all of us. I'm going to share my screen briefly. All right. Okay, the research for this particular paper is the basis for the last chapter of my current book that I'm working on. I've been working on it for quite a while, on the political history of cable television. The broader framework of the book really explores how since the 1960s, advocates for cable television, whether they're policymakers, activists, lobbyists, cable operators, that they all argued that market competition from the medium would bring much needed diversity, transparency, and choice to the television dial. In their view, alternative forms of news programs in particular would solve the civic problems that network monopolies begot by providing a limited, elite, white and male perspective on public affairs. Of course, C-SPAN as a network and Brian Lamb as a policymaker and then a media reporter, and then the drive behind C-SPAN and President and CAO, both of those play a really important role in the broader book project as a historical development itself. But the C-SPAN archives are also a key historical source in my research. And I think that the earlier papers show just the wealth of material that are in the archives. I think we frequently just think about the C-SPAN archives as, you know, relaying the congressional proceedings, but in fact, there's so much more. The call-in programs, the educational programs, conferences. There are conferences throughout the 1980s and 1990s where political consultants discuss their approach to cable television. They share ideas about how we conquer this new medium. There are even workshops that cable operators organize to teach politicians how to use cable television. So what I wanted to do with my time today is to share some of the clips that I found really important in understanding this age of cable news, what that means, and the changes it brought to the media and political landscape. And I also want to really emphasize why the video, the actual video matters. So first, I will take you to February of 1984 and a congressional hearing on election news coverage. The context for this is a discussion about what happened in the 1980 on election night in 1980. When the networks called the election for Reagan just after 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Carter actually conceded before 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And the problem was that the polls were still open in Western states. And so the question emerged of whether or not this early call discouraged voters from going to the polls on the West Coast. It was also controversial because the networks used exit polling that year to shape coverage of the election that day and to make earlier than usual predictions about what was going to unfold. In the wake of that election, there were academic symposiums discussing appropriate media coverage and even a congressional hearing. And this is really significant because in this footage, you can see ABC, NBC, and CBS testifying before Congress alongside Ted Turner, who had just launched CNN in 1980 and didn't have the newsroom operations or the money to do such extensive election day coverage. But Turner is really fascinating here because he comes to these hearings with a purpose. He wanted to use this moment to advance a criticism of network news practices.
Katie, can you reshare that with the audio shared on it?
What? Oh, sorry. Sorry, what do I need to do?
The volume's just really low on the audio.
Okay, let me.
It's possible when you selected share screen, you didn't click off on share audio.
Sorry.
So I would say unshare screen, and then when you share screen again, there'll be a little box to tick on the bottom left.
Got it. Oh, yep. Thank you, Heather.
Sure.
Okay, let's try this again.
Households have access to network television. Study after study shows that more people rely on network television as their primary source of news and information than on newspapers and other sources. Additionally, study after study has demonstrated a correlation between violence in society and violence in television programming. Study after study has criticized network television for its banal and harmful characterization of women and minorities, for the lack of quality children's programming, for sensationalism and lack of objectivity in news reporting, and generally making a mockery of all the institutions that have made this country great, including the military, business, family, religion, government, and so forth. Despite growing dissatisfaction with network television, the networks remain insensitive to the public interest and these social interests in their uncontrolled desire for ratings and revenues. The issue of election projections is but one more example of their network arrogance. The issue before us is an issue of responsibility. Their broadcast licenses specify that they will serve the public interest, not their short-term financial interest. They should be held to a standard of good citizenship and responsible journalism and other programming practices, and should voluntarily refrain from practices impacting the editorial, the electoral process that is so critical to us all. The networks and the broadcast industry they serve are currently seeking legislation to repeal many of the public interest obligations imposed by the Communications Act. I feel that the networks do not deserve to be deregulated. In my opinion, their licenses, proceedings should begin to see whether their licenses should be withdrawn for their repeated failures to fulfill their obligation to serve the people of this nation, the public interest. I am not optimistic about the ultimate success of voluntarism as a solution.
Okay, so for here you can see that for Turner and the broader, this is a strategy deployed by many within the cable industry, portraying the broadcast industry as elitist and arrogant had become central to promoting cable television as an essential alternative to advance both democracy and consumer choice. And those things were really wound up in one another, that having consumers have access to choice was essential for democracy. And what's really striking in this hearing is that the legislators agreed with him. Those people who are overseeing the hearings, Tim Wirth is the chairman, but for many people who were participating, the elected officials, they agreed. You could see them nodding along with some of Turner's criticism. And so finally, cable advocates had an audience among members of Congress. And I'm going to
households.
I'm going to show you this next clip because I think this gets to, again, why the visuals and what you wouldn't necessarily see in the congressional record, how that can inform our understanding of this event.
The very fact we talk to you immediately raises your defenses. Am I incorrect?
Doesn't bother me at all.
Okay. Mr. Shore were here, we might ask him. It might raise a few of his defenses a little bit. Yeah. All right. Now, what I'm suggesting to you is I think there is evidence the public is becoming increasingly concerned with the practice you have. They have no means to express that dissatisfaction to you through the marketplace, and in this instance, because of the peculiar relationship between the news media and government, that avenue to them is, if not closed, is largely wounded. Now, how in the world is the American public going to get your attention and express something to you in clear-cut terms to which you would respond?
So I think that's, sorry, and it goes, yeah, the audio cuts out of that, but and that's one of the challenges of some of this footage because it is quite old. But here you can see he gets upset, and throughout it, his face gets really red. He says that he's trying to keep his temper, but the way that he's interacting with the network news executives, you can see the emotion here. You can see Turner just egging him on and egging the members of Congress on in the criticism that develops. And I think this is really important to understand the context of 1984, that at this time, the House and Senate are debating legislation to deregulate the cable industry that ultimately passes on a bipartisan, overwhelmingly on a bipartisan basis that October. And so you can see here the ways in which cable figures are actively trying to get elected officials to see the benefit of cable television and to think about television differently. And this ultimately helps the cable television industry grow dramatically over the next 10 years and ultimately upend traditional network newsroom practices. So what actually changed in terms of television news and the cable dial? How and why? Well, there are a couple of things I want to point out, and we can talk about this more in depth in the Q&A as well. So I would say that it starts with Turner's very operations and his contention that the news can make money, and really celebrating this as a money-making venture. The dominant assumption of the post-war network newsrooms was that it cost money to make the news, but it was part of the corporate commitment to the public good. Their social responsibility, and that it helped to justify their status as a regulated monopoly. But CNN takes a very different approach. You can see right here that they schedule these advertising seminars to really encourage how do you reach out to advertisers and sell them on the importance of buying ads on CNN. So CNN makes money both through subscriptions and by selling ads. And then it also led a lot of different market research into audience demographics that it could then sell to advertisers. To do this, Turner also offered a very different interpretation of the news, where he emphasized that the news would be the star, but so too would commentary and debate. Missing from his version of the news was the celebrity anchor, the Walter Cronkite, right, that simply read the news. And it emphasized the news as being more interactive and engaging and responsive to audience demands and consumer demands. And in fact, what's really fascinating is that the network, or the broadcasting networks, were actually really interested in trying to tap into this type of cable news. But it took 16 years to launch competitors to CNN. And one of the reasons I would argue is that Turner was there first, and Turner built CNN and the entire Turner Broadcasting Company on this hostility to broadcasting networks. And you can see this very clearly in 1982. ABC joined with Group W to try to launch a competitor to CNN called Satellite News Channel. And Turner took out all of these advertisements to remind cable advocates that they needed to go with CNN because you couldn't trust the networks. So this animosity to the network served a lot of different functions. Ultimately, it took until 1992 for the networks to find a viable way to compete with CNN. And this in part came from a regulatory shift in the 1992 Cable Consumer Act that mandated retransmission consent from cable operators if they were going to retransmit the local affiliates programming, which many of them did, that they had to pay some sort of fee to the networks. And ultimately, the cable companies did not want to have to pay cash to networks. So instead, they gave them a place on the cable dial. And this ultimately allowed broadcasters to create more cable programming throughout the 1990s. And for NBC, this is the motivating factor behind America's Talking, which was their effort to take advantage of this new policy. It was developed by Roger Ailes, who is a newcomer, a relative newcomer at NBC. And the channel emphasized commentary and engagement with viewers through call-in programs. The show struggled and Ailes conflicted with NBC executives. So in May of 1995, when NBC announced its plans to have an interactive venture with Microsoft and what would become MSNBC, notably Roger Ailes was excluded. And he then, of course, angry at NBC, eager to launch his own a different style of a 24/7 news program. He partnered with Rupert Murdoch, and he wanted to tap into that conservative audience. And that drove Murdoch and Ailes to launch a competitor, a third cable competitor with Fox News that fall. Again, I'm happy to talk more about some of the specifics of that, but I think what's really interesting is that by the fall of 1996, you have three 24/7 cable stations competing with one another and the big network broadcasters. So what does this mean? And I think that there are a lot of changes that happen in the newsrooms, but one of the things I want to pull out is an interview that Roger Ailes does. And this is what's really fascinating about the C-SPAN archives, is because there are a lot of conversations about the shifting television news environment during the 1990s on C-SPAN, where they talk about practices and they normalize different procedures and attitudes. And here's a great example. I can't play the clip because you actually lose the visuals through the clip. But I will, but this is kind of this conversation where you have executives from Fox, CNN, and CBS talking about the changing face of television news. And the audio here is Roger Ailes.
And when a lot of television is fighting for its life. I also think it's important for all of us to become much less defensive about all of this. I mean, if you think about our offerings today to both the American public and to the international audience, networks provide sports, movies, soap operas, and news and entertainment. And if we can grow the news and entertainment category and provide more information, both in the form of news hours or half hours and very good news shows, aren't our viewers really helped? Absolutely. To have more news and information and perhaps less of the time allotted to sports. I'm a great sports fan in many ways, or to movies. I love movies. Soaps. I don't like soaps. But, you know, we have an obligation. So these magazines have proliferated. And they proliferated because, for many cases, they're less expensive for the networks to produce than going out and, you know, getting ER or whatever. But, hey, let's celebrate the fact that we are trying to do more for our viewers rather than less, provided we do it well.
So there's a consensus here, and all of the executives are agreeing upon this conversation that choice, commentary, and the packaging of the news, rather than just the reporting of it, mattered. And so again, you can see the blending of news and entertainment that's happening through these conversations. But 2 years later, during the 2000 election, this proved very problematic because the desire to cut costs and generate ratings led to a partnership between all of the news sources where they all pooled data resources with the Voter News Service. And so the Voter News Service was something they all bought into, and that provided the data. And then each network would have their own election desks analyze it. According to one critic, it created, quote, the age where networks artificially compete using identical information supplied simultaneously, but reaching their own conclusions on their own timetable. Of course, the debacle of media coverage of the 2000 election made clear the problems with this. As the Al Gore was projected to win Florida and then the presidency, that was then retracted, and then Bush was projected to win Florida and the presidency, and that too was then retracted. But here's the thing. I thought that when I would look at the congressional hearings that resulted in the aftermath of this, similar to 1984, or in the aftermath of the 1980 election that played out in 1984 that I began with, I thought that there would be a criticism or maybe a push for changes to happen in the media environment. Worth ended in 1984. By reminding the networks that they had a significant trust responsibility and Congress would be watching them. The end of the 2001 hearings on what happened on the 2000 election evening coverage, the chairman ends by encouraging better practices, but also saying that the marketplace will result in the changes needed. And that, quote, I will fight to the death to protect your right to keep doing this wrong if you really want to do it wrong. So again, he's really emphasizing this question of First Amendment rights, and but throughout the conversations, he really believes that the marketplace would restore integrity. But in fact, It only cemented the role of entertainment and commentary in shaping cable news. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie, and thank you again to all three of our panelists. I'm going to take probably no more than a minute or two to try to kind of pull these three talks together and then start asking questions of our panelists, because I think there's a certain tension that's at play among the three papers, a healthy tension as to, you know, raising big questions for us. And that to me is the tie among these papers is what's good for American democracy. Is it access to more unmediated content from politicians? You know, Heather mentions at the beginning of her paper that the parties wanted, the parties basically wanted the networks to set up a camera at the convention and broadcast what they put on from the podium, that this was a show. And they wanted to put, you know, they didn't want the news networks to say, well, hey, there's news happening outside the door, or the real news is in the back rooms, let's cover it. They didn't want that. They wanted the unmediated coverage. And the journalists pushed back and said, well, no, that's not news. We're not serving our audiences as kind of a mouthpiece or a pass-through of things. By contrast, Allison points to C-SPAN's unmediated coverage of Jesse Jackson. The opposite here, where they're just playing his speeches and playing his clips, is getting around kind of the racial biases of the press, and the press making a judgment that Jackson is not viable because he's not held elective office in the past. And she's making the counter case that what we've got for democracy, the better thing and the value of C-SPAN is they have these call-in shows that are presenting criticisms of the media for ignoring Jackson, and that journalists are not serving a mediating function. And Katie's paper kind of comes in and says, you know, the kind of Ted Turner piece of this, first of all, which is, hey, the market should decide this, that if there's a demand for something, let's provide it. And he too is criticizing the broadcasters, saying you're shirking the public interest in the way you present this. You're more worried about ratings and revenue than good journalistic practices. So all the shibboleths and the norms about you being a positive mediating influence, they're wrong from another perspective. And then you kind of have the Roger Ailes perspective at the end, and the one that I think that cable news has kind of turned into, which is, well, let's just provide commentary. Let's have endless commentary panels. And instead of journalists, instead of shoe leather, instead of reporting, we're going to analyze what happens in the news. We're going to play for you a speech. But I think, you know, this question of mediated versus unmediated was ringing in my ears, especially because I don't think that we can see it in the same way as we might have read the Jackson criticisms in the 80s. At least for me, I kind of saw it through the lens of now the counter criticisms of, well, you gave Donald Trump all this airtime and you aired his speeches no matter what he was peddling, and there was no mediating institution. And there's no doubt that that's what politicians want, but is this a healthy thing? So my first question to the three panelists is, what has the rise of cable news and cable in general meant for democracy?
I mean, I can start because I'm thinking a lot about this with the book. And I mean, to me, I think it's, as someone who studies the history of the media, I think it's really important not to romanticize, you know, this age of network news when it was objective and everyone was informed, because of course that was incredibly biased. And it did present only one particular interpretation. It adhered to official sources. You know, there's so much problematic with romanticizing this time when TV and democracy went hand in hand, because I don't think that was ever the case. I think that it just changes. I think that the main argument of my new book is that cable really brings the marketplace and this question of privatization into how people engage with one another, how they engage with their elected officials, that it becomes more tied to the marketplace and marketplace factors. And so, you know, that means that more perspectives are out there, that women and minorities and, you know, people who didn't have a voice on the the television dial previously can find ways to get their ideas out there, to get their perspective, to get their voices, and to shape conversations. And so there's that benefit, but then it also does, you know, again, make it about what people want, not necessarily, or, you know, what sells, not necessarily what's good for civic conversations and public knowledge.
Yeah, I of course would agree that we don't want to over romanticize that network era. At the same time that we also don't want to over romanticize in general the mass era compared to a niche era, and that the niche era has brought with it the diversity of opinions and representations that Katie points to. And I find myself slipping into that romanticization sometimes, even though as I'm trying to fight it, because I do see a value in trying to speak to a kind of mythical everyone, of making the effort. And there was a modesty among the network news people at that time that, like, we're gonna fail. Like, in fact, don't say objective, say fair. They hated the use of the word objectivity. They said, no, it's fairness and balance we're striving for, but we're never going to be objective, you know? And I think there's value in, like, pointing to that as a great effort. And that was a moment when, it, you know, as Katie concluded about, you know, the difference between, like, what people want and what people might need, whatever that is. And, you know, when we look back to the network era of news, sometimes that's sort of seen as so-called green vegetable programming, you know, like, eat your broccoli, watch this show, and then you can watch All in the Family, something else that might, I mean, All in the Family is a great example because that's also social issues. But the point is, you know, this is the serious stuff that you need. This is your vitamin pill every day, and then you can go do this other stuff. And without being romantic about it, there is a loss there, you know, in a kind of sense that, however romanticized it might be, that there's some kind of sense of civic duty to watch the news, in the way that there used to be a civic duty to read the newspaper. And then with the rise of TV, they're okay, well, you watch the local news and you watch the evening news, and then you watch a bunch of not soap operas, that's Roger Ailes, but entertainment programming, and you watch Johnny Carson. But, like, somehow watching the news was seen as a sort of, you know, duty that was understood as kind of neutral. And I would argue that's, you know, we can't go back to that. You can't unscramble your egg, as they often say about, you know, the deregulation of broadcasting. But it's worth trying to think about what could possibly be retrieved from that moment to help us think through the present moment.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add. I mean, I would just maybe rephrase what Katie and Heather have said, that one of the things I know political communication scholars have noted with the expansion of cable and just the expansion of media outlets is the erosion of the inadvertent audience, right? The people who might not care about watching the news, but if you turn on the TV at 6:30 p.m., that's basically all you get to watch. And so it cultivated a sense of public awareness of current events and politics that is now very easily avoided because there's so many viewing options. I guess, Brian, I loved your comments and I loved the way that you put our papers in conversation. I guess one of the things that I would maybe want to push on is the notion of unmediated, right? Because certainly a network like C-SPAN does not have routinely anchors that are offering interpretation. It's not creating media frames and selecting particular clips as a stand-in for an entire address. But it's certainly a mediated practice, you know, both in the selection of what gets covered and what doesn't. I was really fascinated by those kinds of choices, looking at the Jackson coverage of how many panels there are with political consultants, right? You know, that's a deliberate choice, but I saw almost no panels of activists, right? Or other kinds of political actors who might have something to say about the 1980 election. I also found I didn't really have a space to deal with it in this paper, but even though the aesthetics of C-SPAN is like a camera in a room and it feels like there's an air of neutrality, the camera moves sometimes, and the selection of audience members to focus on in terms of getting reactions to the speech also felt quite deliberate, especially in relationship to Jackson. I felt like there was almost a desire to find people of color in the audience to see their reactions to what he was saying. And so I think there are different levels of mediation, but even a network like C-SPAN is engaging in particular practices that are shaping how it is that we're interpreting the political environment that we're viewing.
Yeah,
That's a good point.
I was just going to add, those are great points. And I was just going to add that, when you look at material on C-SPAN about the 1968 convention and election and so on, you do see more activists like on the panels, right? And part of that has to do with it as a historical event that C-SPAN is curating events around versus events being covered as they happened, and the kind of difference of approach there, and the difference between the kind of material you can find on stuff that happened before C-SPAN existed versus the kinds of material that arise after C-SPAN was created.
And I actually, your comments, Allison, made me think of the big question that I had as you were talking, and that is, does Jesse Jackson make C-SPAN and cable a priority? Does his campaign recognize this opportunity, and does that then shape his approach to the C-SPAN cameras, right? Or his approach to cable more broadly? I'm wondering if you have had a chance to look at it from his side in terms of his media and political strategy.
That's an excellent question. The Jackson campaign had far less money than his opponents, and so he relied on free media far more than like Mondale did in '84, or Hart or Dukakis and the other more established political figures in '88. And so there's a real recognition on the Jackson campaign that they need that kind of coverage of campaign rallies and campaign events because they're not able to do similar kinds of ad buys. My sense, just in terms of campaign organization, is that in '84 it was kind of a serendipity when he got covered. He had many of the people who worked for his campaign, which I think in part helped shape the very leftist, progressive approach he took to policy, weren't necessarily campaign professionals. They were social democrats, they were leftists, they were social activists who were trying to activate a diverse constituency for Jackson. And so what a number of scholars have noted is what that meant is they weren't very good at scheduling, at press releases, at contacting journalists to let them know where Jackson was going to be. I mean, one of the things that you notice if you watch a lot of Jesse Jackson speeches is that he's almost always late, and so there's always a little bit of time on the C-SPAN coverage waiting for him to get there. And so I think to C-SPAN's credit, they covered his events a great deal, but I don't know if it was a deliberate strategy as much as a serendipitous opportunity for the Jackson campaign. But certainly he did rely on that coverage because he was so under-resourced in comparison to his opponents. So that's an excellent question. Thank you.
And I think that raises another question. And I think Allison was 100% right. Mediated might not have been the right word for what I was looking for, which is that, when you interview politicians and communications operatives, they're always saying, we want as little filter as possible. We don't want some guy asking questions. We don't want the press deciding what to clip from speech. We don't want the press even deciding a speech is worthless, that's not newsworthy. Right? They want you to be able to just watch the politician and whatever the show they want to put on and message they want to put out. And they don't like any filtration. They don't like any intermediaries. They want to be able to just, feed the public whatever spin or slant, or in the case of today's Republicans, falsehood that they, can come up with and that they think is going to be beneficial. But what's interesting here is you've got conservatives starting a little bit later in the 80s, especially saying bias about journalists. At the same time, you've got Jesse Jackson on the left as an activist type, as an outsider type, saying bias. And, are these journalistic judgments good things for the public? Are they doing kind of the noble journalistic role of balancing things, of vetting things? Or are they perpetuating biases in these things? And one thing that I would note that I was kind of putting together about what Katie said versus what Allison was just saying about Jackson is that, one criticism of cable news is that they showed Donald Trump without any filter forever in 2016 and advanced him because he was a good show, because he was good for ratings. And that is this something where maybe we were headed on a good path, and then as the money incentives start to snowball in the 80s, as Katie talked about, as Turner shows that there's money to be made, does that then derail the whole thing, where instead of the public interest and kind of trying to be better than the broadcasters, that they just go for what's going to make the money?
Well, yes, that was a classic, more of a comment than a question. I think, Brian, you're exactly right. Yeah.
I'm trying to work through these things and think of them in real time here. But, it is a question of, do journalists, do we think that the journalistic role is good here, or is it more bad, I guess, that intermediary vetting kind of thing?
Well, I think it can be both, right? I don't think, it can, that there is a push for that bottom line. And I think that shapes productions, what is selected, who's selected to be on certain programs. I absolutely think that it's all about the bottom line. But does that mean that individual journalists aren't trying to find out certain, aren't trying to put together the facts? Some are, maybe some are not. Some are not as concerned. And so I think both can kind of exist at the same time, and at times you see the triumph of one over the other. And I think and those can be really transformative moments, because it shows the deep problems, perhaps, of that market incentive. I think that's where I think the 2000 election is something that you really do see because of the botch coverage. It did generate this national conversation about, can we trust the media, and what does that mean? What does trust mean? What are we looking to the media for? And that's what I found so interesting, is that there is this recognition that, yeah, they're all about ratings, and we know that, and we accept that. There's an acceptance almost that comes out in those conversations.
So one of the things that I found really fascinating, there's a wonderful book probably most people on this call know about it, called The C-SPAN Revolution, which kind of gives an overview of its development. And the authors are discussing the development of the call-in show. One of the instructions for the hosts was to facilitate conversation, but not to express knowledge, not to express opinion, to just basically be a neutral facilitator of conversation between guests and callers. And so what that meant is, if people were saying blatantly wrong things, the host was not empowered to correct it. So on the one hand, it was this vision of the town hall, unobstructed by a journalist, but on the other, it could let misinformation fly without any kind of corrective. And so I think we all would acknowledge like an important role for the press of calling out falsehoods when they're articulated, or that part of the role of the journalist is to hold people to account, if for nothing else, to tell the truth. So that's, I guess, one point I would make. I had another point about cable that has now just slipped my mind, that was sort of inspired by what Katie was just saying. So I maybe will stop talking and see if Heather has comments, and I can circle back if I remember.
Well, I guess I was just going to say that there's, we think about the profit issue, we bounce off of each other the issue of a sort of nonprofit motive in the network era versus a high profit motive in the post-network or cable era. And of course, it oversimplifies the network era when network news was highly profitable. They just pretended that they weren't. Right. So the amount of money that ads sold for on, say, Huntley Brinkley was huge. Right. And they were making more money than, Bonanza on ads for Huntley Brinkley, until Bonanza went into syndication. And then you take that into account, because you can't syndicate and rerun Huntley Brinkley in the way you can Bonanza and other, Gunsmoke, all the most popular shows, right? So the public image was, we made no profit whatsoever, we're here to benefit the public. And the reality was, we're absolutely here to make money for the network. And that's what the suit said, right? But then the journalists were not supposed to think about that. They were instructed, don't deal with the financial issues, just deal with the news. That's your job. And if you talk about ratings, in the office, you're going to get in trouble. Like, explicitly, there were memos released that said that, right, at CBS News. So anyway, and then, the profit motive with cable seems so very obvious, even as someone like Ted Turner is attacking the network. That's amazing footage, Katie, just like all that violence and sex and immorality and profit motive, and like, because Ted Turner is an angel, right? Mm-hmm. Just insane, right? The difference, so it's not a profit versus non-profit versus profit, right? It's just like a different approach to how profitability works, but it's also a different approach to the issue of time. So that in the network era, the problem is you don't have enough time for all the news. And there's a famous anecdote about Cronkite where one day in the CBS office, they put up the front page of the New York Times, and they showed, how much news coverage they did in one, just on one page of the Times compared to 1 half-hour Cronkite show. And Cronkite got in just a little bit less than 1 page of the New York Times. And it was kind of a joke, but also completely real. And he was really aware of that. He was constantly making editorial decisions to squeeze stuff in because there just wasn't enough time to really do anything, right? And now we have the opposite issue of too much time. And as I think Brian mentioned, opened with earlier, how do you fill that time? Commentary. Just and yeah, others have references too, just like put up a speech and then just comment on it endlessly. And so, Allison's point about this other model for how you fill time as a call-in show is interesting because it gets away from just the pundit who, has all these ideas, or the panel of pundits who just talk and talk without doing any reporting. So the call-in show is a different idea that could fill time in what you might call a more civically responsible manner, if the host was capable of correcting mistruths, or if you could keep out, right wing or left wing, whoever, nuts, and somehow pull things a little more towards the center, towards the possibility of civil conversation or something, it would be a different way to fill that time. So I just wanted to bring in the time element as a different way to think about it, and to get away from just like a not-profit, for-profit kind of model.
To some extent, we have the same situation in terms of the 80s and the 90s, right? Heather and Allison are talking about a time when, or at least Allison is, Heather was not there, but when we get to the early 80s, we've got CNN and C-SPAN. You've got 2 networks. Now you get to today where you have 6, 7, 8 of them, and we've kind of oversliced or sliced into such small areas that people can live in silos. So it's kind of like we've seen the same thing, that once you unleash these forces, it's not like you can hit the stopping point and say, okay, that's it, we're done. I have more questions, but I would like to try to get it open to the audience, see if anybody else would like to ask something, so we can get a couple questions in. So don't be shy. You can use the raise your hand icon. Robert?
Katie, do you see any difference between the 80s and the 90s? What's your key differences? I know that you got a whole book you're doing, but I was looking at, as what Brian just said, we had CNN and C-SPAN in the 80s, and MSNBC and Fox News come in 96. So I was just trying to think what differences you see.
Yeah, I think that to me, the biggest difference is the number of news, and I put that, in quotation marks, but the number of news or public affairs or networks or programs that you have. It expands dramatically in the 1990s. And I do think that line between entertainment and news is really blurred in different ways. So I think that has always been a line that's been increasingly blurred, but I think it's really intensified where you have MTV having news programs, you have Comedy Central having news programs that, so yes, you have like the MSNBC and Fox that come in 96, but even before then, you're having all of these other types of programs on different cable networks that are taking an approach to the news. And I think, MTV is just so fascinating in this capacity because in the 1992 election, they see this as an opportunity that, we're going to tell our younger viewers what's happening. And, and they send out people to interview candidates and, of course, bring candidates, very famously Clinton and Gore on their program. So I think that's, to me, is that line between entertainment and news is just really, it doesn't really exist. It's completely gone almost by the 1990s, where I still think that was still there, and that at least some kind of difference was there in the 80s.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Joshua?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the acknowledgement here. And I have been here listening. It's been fascinating stuff. So I guess the question is for the whole panel in some ways, and it was triggered by this Ted Turner speech that was shown, which I found quite entertaining for reasons that were just pointed out. But if I'm thinking of, if we view CNN or Ted Turner's original, attempts to get into the TV game as like this kind of third party or stepchild of sorts, and then finds a way into the mainstream. Have any of you engaged this type of research with third party candidates? And I think obviously like Ross Perot, Ralph Nader, some of the bigger names from history, but recently it seems there's a larger push to include more third party candidates into the election cycle coverage. Yet there's clearly hesitance from news organizations to do that for profit-centric reasons. But does this research have any value in much the same way we would look at CNN as like a third party, to look at it the other way and say, how might news coverage and its coverage of third party candidates in a presidential election inform kind of a greater knowledge base of this political communication process?
I would just respond in one small way and say that in 1968, Nixon didn't want to do a real debate, having been slammed in 1960 and so on, right? And he wanted to control media completely and not interact with the other side. It's famously been told in The Selling of the President in 1968. But he and Humphrey also, they didn't want George Wallace to get any airtime. And of course, Wallace wanted to run on the Democratic ticket, and there was anxiety that he would run on a third party ticket at some point and so on. And so even as a debate, the debates would have been desirable, I think, more on the Humphrey side. There was also concern, like, why would we want to give Wallace any airtime at all? Let's just keep him out of the equation as an extremist, and it served both of them to keep him out. And of course, Nixon was concerned he would steal, votes from him, which, he did, but whatever, he still won. But so there was a concern in the past around the, again, as I said, he wasn't a third party candidate per se, but he could have been, but there was concern about keeping extremists out of the discussion. Okay. And obviously that is a big change now, where extremists are very much in the discussion. They're central in American politics right now in a way that they were sort of filtered out in the network era, or at least treated very differently, not filtered out.
So I actually have not done any research on this question, but I think it's a really fascinating one. But just anecdotally, I have very strong memories of watching the 2004 Green Party convention on C-SPAN. And it was a very memorable moment for me, because I, had political interest in the Green Party, and actually watching that convention persuaded me not to vote for it. I mean, there was a way that actually allowing cameras into this like very sparsely populated hotel room where everybody was in like Birkenstocks and tie-dyes. And I know that's a gross caricature, but it's actually not an entirely incorrect description. And listening to impassioned speeches, but ones that seemed entirely divorced from the practices of governance was powerful for me. And so I imagine, actually, if we've dug into the C-SPAN archives, we would see a pretty tremendous range of political candidates outside of the two major parties. But there is a question about the degree to which it's an asset to those parties, especially based on their own development of resources and of campaign acumen and seriousness about governance, to the degree to which it would actually help them with electoral outcomes.
I'll just interject, and then I want Katie to talk about, I just want to say, I want to encourage everyone to watch Nation Time, which is a documentary about the 1972 Black political convention that got no media coverage. And so they created their own imagery of that moment. So Katie, I'm sorry to cut you off.
No,
yeah, I want to hear is the last word here on Ross Perot.
I would just add that one of the first way that CNN made waves in the 1980 election was including John Anderson in a presidential debate. And that was something that they could do because it was up to Turner to make that decision. And so I think that it did kind of foreshadow that third parties would find a lot of opportunity on the cable dial. 1992 is another great example that Ross Perot and Larry King Live went hand in hand. Right, that became central to his ability to wage his third party bid. So I think that Yes, because of the time. And you see that with a lot of the conversations among politicians as they're working through their strategy with cable, that those who don't have the resources, right, Allison, like Jesse Jackson, and are thinking through this, they're strategic about, okay, we'll take anything. Just as a way to get out there, and there are booking departments at CNN that are looking for people, and so you know, these are people that have a desire to not get paid, right, but to be as a pundit or someone offering commentary, because it can boost their political career.
You see the same thing in the same era in talk radio, what I've written a book about. Essentially, these new media that come up, if you're the marginalized guy, you find a lot of attraction in these media because they need guests and you need airtime, and you're not getting on Meet the Press, or, you know, NBC's not cutting in live when you speak like you're the president. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but I want to thank all three panelists again, and thank Andrea and Robert for organizing this really insightful session. Hopefully that those of you in the audience really gain something from it, but these are really interesting questions and these scholars are doing fantastic work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you all.
Thank
you. Thank you for fielding my question.